Hello, my name is Connor,
And I'm Jason.
and you're listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
In 2 weeks, we will have our episode where we process through questions you have or areas that you'd want to dive deeper or observations you've made that we would want to include in our thinking. And so we'd encourage you to share those with us, either comment on our Facebook page, or you can email us at amazedandperplexed@gmail.com. We don't know how to do this best, but we want to keep inviting your thoughts because there's great value in what God is doing in you and your perspective, and we would love to share in that. Our passage for today is Mark chapter 10, 17 through 22. As Jesus started on his way, a man ran up to him and fell on his knees before him. "Good teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "Why do you call me good?" Jesus answered, "No one is good except God alone. You know the commandments: you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not give false testimony, you shall not defraud, honor your father and mother." "Teacher," he declared, "all these I have kept since I was a boy." Jesus looked at him and loved him. "One thing you lack," he said. "Go sell everything you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me." At this, the man's face fell. He went away sad because he had great wealth.
What amazes me about this passage is so often when I look at my own faith journey or I look at what the church views as the correct way for growth or discipleship is it's basically like, it's almost like a math equation. Like you have to, you add a little bit of prayer, you add a little bit of going church attendance, you subtract your, bad habit of watching gory TV, subtract talking back to your wife, you add this, you subtract that, and maybe at some point you even multiply and create more versions of yourself. And there is this sense for this rich young ruler that all I got to do is I got to add something, right? He's figured out all these other things. He's worked out the path. He's worked out the equation, and he's missing one variable. And if he can just figure out that one variable, he'll be happy. And what's funny is Jesus speaks his language. This man asks for a variable to be answered, and Jesus gives it to him, but the man doesn't see it. The man doesn't see the underpinnings of what Jesus is trying to get across. And what I love about Jesus and what amazes me about Jesus is every time we want to get to him, or we want to get to the fulfillment or get to the joy that he offers, we have this sense or belief that we need to add or subtract. And the message that Jesus is trying to tell us over and over and over again is, I want to blow up the whole equation. And if any of you hate math like I do, that is good news.
Good news. Yeah, that right there, I would say it a little bit different way, but it is also what amazes me is the specificity. There you go. That's a good word. The specificity of Jesus. This is not a shtick. And this is not just with this man. When you really start to look at Jesus and his interactions, and if you didn't know what the Bible said and you were just going to project what Jesus is going to answer, you would think he'd say things like I grew up with. Well, you want to believe. Well, you got to hear first, and then you got to believe, and then you got to, do these kind of things. So specific. And that is amazing that he would know exactly the answer this man needed. Now, there's sadness I feel over the man's response, but to be so tuned in to the moment, to not being worried about what anybody else would think. We didn't read the section where everybody's reacting against Jesus. Now, you may not think about it that way, but like, hey, if the rich can't be saved, but it's that idea of he sees him as an individual. He doesn't see him as a collective. He doesn't see him as a principle. He doesn't see him as, well, what did I already set as precedent? It's so, I'm with you, you young man, I'm with you, man, on your knees.
So often in times when I am interacting with people or dealing with people, so much of it is about what can I get out of them? And part of that is analyzing who is this person? What category do they fit in my history, in my in just what kind of person I want to be around. And I do think when we live a cross-centered life, when we live a selfless life like Jesus does, he tends to blow up those categories, and it's a lot easier to focus in on the individual and much less so exactly what you were getting at.
My temptation in working with anybody is I have a strong voice in my head that's been there since I was a kid that says success is this person will look you in the eye and say, that really helped me. You did a good job there. It's like a dog coming up and wanting petted. You know what I mean? I'm talking about me, you know, I'm just saying.
I'm sorry that I've never pet you, Jason.
Yeah, this is the whole point of this discussion. To be able to set that aside and say, I just want to be here for this person in this moment. I don't want to think, well, where will this go? I don't want to overcommit. I don't want to undercommit but just to be in that moment, that takes great discipline. And sometimes I hit that mark and sometimes I miss it. But part of me not missing it more and more is realizing that temptation to myself. And Jesus is so selfless. We've talked about this in other contexts. I don't even know if we've talked about it on the podcast. But just if you had a sense that, man, you're here to impact the world, and we know from Jesus' temptation by the devil that he wants everybody. And this, I would think uniformity would be on his mind. I hear all the time in leadership, don't send a mixed message. This is the only person in the whole of Scripture that Jesus specifically tells, go sell everything, and then you can go. And the disciples say, good. Hey, we've sold everything. And I'm like, no, you didn't. You had access to boats as soon as you thought Jesus was dead, you know? And this idea, plus they weren't rich, you know, they didn't have people that depended on him and on them. And so this idea that he's not worried about sending a mixed message, man, that's amazing.
Oh, absolutely. Man, what you said there, I'd never even thought about that. So circling back around, okay, the grand plan for Jesus, his hope, right, is the salvation of the world. And man, when we think about this podcast, right, is like we're recording this podcast for a very specific kind of person that's going to be interested into it. Like we know that there are certain types of personalities and certain types of people that this is just not going to be their thing, and that's completely okay. And what's amazing to me about what you said about Jesus is this is the difference, I think, and you can correct me, between Jesus versus religion, right? Religion says fit in this box, or if this isn't your cup of tea, you need to change your what you want. Yeah, and Jesus, your cup, yes. And Jesus comes in and he helps us in that, or he becomes that flavor in a sense. And he, you know, there's obviously more to that. He asked for change, but I had never even thought about that from that perspective.
So that leads into, for me, what perplexes me about it. And I've spent a lot of time here in my head just thinking through, in a lot of texts, especially gospel narratives, where you have this unfolding story and there's some tension in the story. I ask myself, what is it that would be successful in Jesus' eyes? And so one thing you could say is, so this man goes, I'll do it. And he goes and sells everything. And then he comes and, you know, meets up with Jesus and says, I'm ready. Okay. Number one, Jesus has already chosen his 12 apostles. Jesus has already shown, if you know the story about the man that was possessed by the demons called Legion, that man tried to get in the boat with Jesus. He tried to go with him, and Jesus says, no, basically, I'm not taking more than these 12. You know, and so, and even the selection of the 12, for him to select 12, that means there is Mr. 13, 14, 15, and so on that didn't get chosen. And so this rich young ruler shows up and he's like, I've given it all away. Now I want to be part of your posse because you're all I got left.
And have you ever had the experience of being like playing pickup basketball and you're the 11th and there's
yes.
there's not an even number of people? Oh, it's terrible.
It is. Well, that's why I say I don't like sports. I really don't like rejection. But anyway, it's that idea that how would this have gone successful? And the way I processed it is, so I'll leave it there for a moment, is that it's perplexing. And it's not even considering the fact if he's a rich ruler, which when you add all the gospels to this, that means he has employees, probably has a family, Maybe he's young, he doesn't, but I mean, he's got people he's supporting.
Certainly a highly respected layperson in his synagogue. Certainly very highly esteemed for the fact that he has such a high position, and he is so young. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But yeah, exactly like you said, he is a big deal.
So just ending it there, absolutely. I mean, and honestly, as you start to weigh all this is great cost. And that's what perplexes me. Why does Jesus ask of him something that he asks of no one else? And I have my theories, but that's the part that perplexes me. What about for you?
So we'll circle back around to that a little bit later. What perplexes me, so we will, and probably in a few weeks from now, we'll discuss the prodigal son, and it's one of my favorite stories. But there's an element here that's really interesting. At the very beginning, it says that this man runs up to Jesus, and so for anybody in the Middle East at this time, any patriarch, any high, I keep saying esteemed and high, but any highly esteemed individual, specifically man, to run would be shameful. To run up to somebody else would be lowering yourself, putting themselves at their feet, and it'd be scandalous. And so what's really interesting to me about this is you do have this genuine desire by this man and recognition that he is in need of something. So much so that he's willing to make a fool out of himself. So much so that he's willing to lower himself at the feet of Jesus. So the perplexing thing is this: if in your church somebody like this was to come to you, somebody who knew there was a God, who believed in eternal life, who believed in the consequences of a rejection of the God of the universe, who had lots of money, who was already respected in his community and knew that they needed something more, honestly, if anybody but Jesus, it would be reckless to handle the situation like he does. It'd be reckless not to go, okay, well, let's sit down, let's talk through this. The thing that perplexes me about Jesus is he is not looking at this man like how everybody else in the history of humanity would look. How every other leader in the history of humanity, including myself, would look at him. Because if we're being honest with ourselves, as somebody who is a leader in the church or somebody who is a leader in business, when a really high potential individual comes to you and wants to join your organization or wants to be a part of your movement, you're lying to yourself if you don't start to think about compromising, don't start to fear losing this person. And this is a perfect example of just the contrary nature of what Jesus has come to do. And not even just contrary to the ways of the world, but contrary to common sense. And a lot of times in church, we like to talk about, well, here's the common sense thing and here's yada, yada, yada. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes the common sense is the right thing. But here is a perfect example where common sense fails you.
That opens up a whole, now I'm doubly perplexed. That makes so much sense to me. I remember I served in Ecuador for a couple years, and man, when a marginalized person would come into the church, we would be excited. We would be excited and we would say, man, God, what can you do, through this? But when somebody that was a high achiever, when somebody that already showed a high leadership quotient came in, that excited us in a whole different way. Now, I think in our best moments, we didn't esteem one over the other. But you're exactly right. If it was just up to me, I'm not accusing anyone else of anything. If it was just up to me, I would go a little bit further to be patient with the one that had a high leadership ability, because I'm thinking, oh, this person could lead, in the church, where this other person may or may not, And this is not me confessing proudly. I'm just saying this is an honest response. And I think, okay, how much do I do that now? If I'm interacting with a young person, do I esteem that young person as high as this? So back to your point, why is Jesus shooting himself in the foot? Why is he doing that? To put a weight on this man that, as you say, I mean, so good. He is humbling himself. And this is not when Jesus was at a peak of his popularity. By Mark 10, Jesus is surrounded by controversy. So who knows what kind of flack this man will already take just by bowing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a incredibly important point. He's paying a price already for it. And so that gets to where you kind of left off in terms of what perplexes you and why does Jesus handle this situation? So the question is, Jason, well, answer the question for us.
Well, let me tell you where I am at this moment, and ask me next week, and I'll give you a better answer if Lord wills. Here is what I think. We know this. We know when Jesus starts the Sermon on the Mount, he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." To me, those are building blocks of his message. In other words, if you don't have poor in spirit, if you don't have absolute humility, then you won't notice the things in the world. So you won't mourn, you won't do all these other things, because everything else, if you don't have humility, will lead you to self-aggrandizement, basically. You know what I mean? Even using the kingdom. And I know many people have had experiences in church where they look at a leader and they're like, man, they may have started well, but now they're really consumed with their own power. Well, that's what happens is if humility is not front and center, not that you don't struggle with it, but you're like, man, I must be humble, it's going to have this negative effect. With that in mind, I think success in Jesus' mind is this. Now, there could be other variations, but this is the root of it. I think Jesus wants that man to say, you know what, I've obeyed all those commandments from my youth. He said, well, one last thing, sell everything. And he's like, Jesus, I don't even know how to start that. Can you help me? Can you lead me through that? I am so broken by that question. I realize I'm not coming to you on any sure footing. If that's what I deserve, which is what we all deserve, is to lose everything for the cause of Christ. If that's what I deserve, man, I'm going to need you to be Messiah. I can't be my own Messiah here.
I think it's the key to this passage. I think it's absolutely what Jesus is after, and I think it's a perfect example of what we need to be after in our conversations with everybody. What's interesting, right? Let's just play it out. We can't know exactly because this is a real interaction that happens. It's not a parable. It's something that literally happens to Jesus. And I think Jason and I hope, and I think there's a great possibility that this guy eventually comes back to Jesus.
Yes.
I'm choosing to believe, and I'm choosing, Jason and I have joked about this before. We've talked about this passage so much. We're going to get to heaven and this guy he's just going to make fun of us because we obsess over his story. Jesus gives this, go sell everything. If you go, okay, I'm going to do that. And he runs home. He does it all. He figures it all out. Then he comes to follow Jesus. There's this sense that he would also probably be doing that in his own power, right? So is there a way to selflessly give every single thing away completely selflessly? Without Jesus, I don't think there is. I think that if this man was to just go, yes, I'm going to do it, and he runs back, I think that's just another form of religiosity. I think that's another form of him following all these commandments. I wonder, is there a follow-up if he just goes, yes, and Jesus, is there another prodding question that Jesus would ask? I don't know.
Yeah. Now, rich young ruler, can you go sell everything and take no credit for it? Mm. I don't know what I've never thought about that next step, because the issue here, we understand that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Whatever verse that would be a good picture of you, that God doesn't need our money. He doesn't need our resources. There's nothing we have without him in the first place. So this is not about Jesus saying, I can't handle being with the rich, or the rich are such jerks. He's saying, again, that specificity is like, what does this man need right now? And this is something I have to remember. If I say a truth and then somebody walks away from me, let's say, I sense this person doesn't have a relationship with God, and I say, here's some truth that I feel compelled to share with you, and they walk away, we should never think that's the end. Or else Jesus's conversations, most of them ended that way. I mean,
yes,
there is as many examples of people walking away from Jesus as drawing in closer.
And so there's encouragement, right? If you have these conversations and people are walking away from, now if you're being a jerk, that's a whole different thing.
That's right.
But if you're walking in faith and you just feel like you're coming up against these barriers, man, you're standing right next to Jesus.
That's exactly right. And he doesn't get his feathers ruffled. The comment that he makes, I get the sense that this rich young ruler walks away, but later he'll say how hard it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. Everybody's like, what? Because they thought, like many think today, if you're a Christian and you're wealthy, that means you're really pleasing God because he's physically blessing you. But I would submit to you all the people in the Bible who their life didn't necessarily get better financially. But that dynamic of simply being okay to say a truth, and this is it, and to trust that man, to trust God with that man. In other words, I gave you the truth, I said it in love, and then God loves you a million times more than I'll ever love you. I'm not going to stress over your journey.
You know, even with this podcast, I sense that urge, right, to say something and then to like reach out, dear listener, to you and make sure it touches your heart in the exact way that I mean to. And so there's some caveats to that, right? Like, you know, obviously we're not to speak recklessly. Jesus, he knows exactly what he's saying, and he knows this man incredibly well. But I do think there's a lot of encouragement here for us of, if we are following Jesus, if we are studying God and trying to deepen our relationship with him, and we're living in the Spirit, if we put something out into the world that the world throws back at us, or somebody we love throws back at us, that isn't the end of the story. That isn't the end of the story with that specific person. And it's certainly not the end of the story with how God is working with you in that interaction. There's a famous song. You probably heard it on the radio. I think it's by Corey Asbury. It's not Reckless Love. I think it's The Father's House. There's a line that goes something like this: if it's not good, it's not over. And it's been really speaking to me. If you're faithfully following God in something and it's not good, that God is still moving in that, because I think Jason and I believe ultimately, and this doesn't mean ultimately we all get BMWs, but ultimately God is working all these things for good. So another thing that's really interesting, and this just shows the depth of which Jesus understands Scripture and understands humanity. So Jesus will say, you know, this man will ask, what commandments do I need to keep? What do I need to add to my walk to get me to eternal life? And Jesus walks him through these commandments, right? Here's what you need to do X, here's what you need to do Y. And in that, Jesus, we know from the story, he's challenging the idol worship of this man. This man has made money, made greed his God. And so one of the things that's really clever about what Jesus does here is when he goes through all these commandments, it's not so that he's like checking the list for this man. He's helping evoke the first commandment, right? He's trying to lead him to see what Jesus sees in his heart, and that what he sees in his heart is that he's given himself over to the worship of this false god.
I'll tell you, this is interesting. I've always wondered about why these 6 and not all 10. Why not just, certainly Jesus knows all 10. What's interesting is the 4 that Jesus doesn't quote are all about your relationship with God, which is much more challenging to evaluate and quantify. The other 6 are man-to-man commandments, which we feel at least are more under our control. I didn't murder, I didn't this. There's a much more vague dynamic of no other gods before him. You know, even Sabbath, obviously they have so much conflict around the Sabbath day and what does it mean and this kind of thing. So these first 4 are much more spiritual, between you and God, and has so much to do with what's going on in your heart. And the last 6, those are still between you and God and heart, but we at least have the tendency to make those man to man. More specifically, this is what I can control, or we feel more in control of those 6.
When Jesus points these out, it naturally is going to evoke in this man's mind the other ones that Jesus doesn't bring up.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the big point. I think this whole interaction is designed, even when he says, and we're not commenting on this, but why do you call me good? You know, he's saying, you don't understand what this is. You're looking, my sense is this guy is, how do I say this? I wonder if this guy hasn't bowed down to a lot of rabbis. I just wonder, you know what I mean? And that's not to take anything away from him, because I think he's doing it, trying to do the best he can, but he still has a very, I'm in charge of my faith kind of mentality. And this whole interaction funnels to, do you see you're not in charge? And will you accept that reality? And up to this moment in this story, he's not ready to accept that. And Jesus wants him to sit with that.
No, that's really good. That's really good. So there's one more thing, just kind of piggybacking off what you said. So we already mentioned before how this man runs up to Jesus. He breaks social norms to do that. He falls at his knees. He calls him good teacher, which was a common refrain for prominent rabbis or people that that Jewish people thought were sent by God to teach or to show or to prophesy. And so he has high esteem for this person. For this Jesus person, he's given all the outward signs of being a God person. He's given all of he's doing all the right things. And there's some arguments for what his position is for him to have such esteem is he would be a local leader in the synagogue. So he is doing everything right. He's a lay elder, maybe, in his church, if that means anything to you. He's got a lot going on for himself. And the thing that I love about the story is you would seem, sometimes we read the story and it's like, oh, you poor idiot. You just don't get it. But the sense that I get from the story is that this is an incredibly genuine man. I mean, at the end of it, he says, at this, the man's face fell and he went away sad because he had great wealth. He's probably been searching for the answer that Jesus wants to give his entire life. He's probably run up to many teachers trying to figure that out. And sometimes for me, I've had this tendency to caricature this story of like, oh, it's a wealthy person who wants to cling on to all their money and doesn't want to give it away and hates poor people. But the sense I get from this is just is a confused and broken man who has tried all the paths of religion, who has tried over and over and over again to fix himself, to get over his sin issue, to subtract this, to add that, and it just keeps on not adding up. The equation is always unbalanced. And for me, every time I read the story, I just have so much sympathy for this man because I see myself in him so much. And so that's how I see myself in the story, as the guy who keeps trying to add things up and subtract them and never fully letting Jesus blow up the equation. That's how I see myself in the story. Is there a specific place you see yourself in this, Jason?
I do. I think where I see myself is the man that thinks he's onto something and he runs with it. And in certain circles that's respected and he's applauded maybe, or validated at least. But there's something missing, that agitation in the back of your mind are like, and I feel like I've been in multiple places where I was onto something and I could excel in one aspect of my relationship with God and it was validated, and yet there was something missing. So that certainly is where I relate. And the other part that I certainly hope for him, as you said earlier, and certainly have experienced myself, but continue to hope for me, is that Christ is so invested in me, there's no way he's letting go. He won't let my stupidity get in the way of our relationship. That as long as I'm wanting to know, even if I'm coming up making assertions that are so immature, he's in the long haul. He's going to keep telling me the truth and then nurture me to that truth.
Oh, that's good. And see, this is the difference in terms of when we want to see change in our lives or people's lives. We have this tendency, if we're working with somebody, they've got to get this right now. They have to understand this truth right now. And that's just not the way Jesus works. So much more often, Jesus is in it for the long haul. He's about this slow process. And we've talked about it before with the disciples. Jesus is with these guys for 3 years and they continually do not get it. They are continual dummies. And I say that knowing I'll have to answer them and they can call me dummies over the numerous things that I've said that are very dumb and things that I've done that are very dumb. But over and over again, Jesus is just, they're doing thing. And Jesus, sometimes will say something against it. And sometimes we'll just move on to the next thing. And there's never this sense of Jesus, of he's afraid of their stupidity, their fear. There's just so much peace around Jesus, and he'll act when he needs to act. He'll assert when he needs to assert. But I would just, when I see this Jesus, when I see him not afraid for somebody to turn away from him, when I see him not afraid at confusing his disciples or reorienting his disciples' view of what it is to be successful and the relationship between being rich and being a God person, the perspective that Jesus offers is not a worldly perspective. It's not a common sense perspective. And it's a perspective that I don't have, that I'm desperately trying to get, that I desperately want God to give me.
I think when we think about this passage, what I would hope for all of us is that there'd be a strong message of God sees me where I'm at, and he is ready to work with me. And so this ties right into our overall theme that me being amazed and perplexed by him, or maybe only perplexed or only amazed, that doesn't throw him. Like, he is ready to work with me where I'm at, and it may not seem pleasant at first, but he knows he is that precision-tuned coach that comes alongside you and says, this is what you need. And even if you stumble over that 1,000 times before you get it, he's like, yeah, this is the nature of our work together.
Thank you so much for listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast. Jason and I, we thank you so much for taking the time to do this. If you've enjoyed this at all, we would really appreciate you subscribing in whatever platform you listen to your podcasts. And if your platform has a review system, we would like you to give us 5 stars or, a thumbs up or whatever that may look like for you. If it's anything less than 5 stars, please don't hurt us. Please don't hurt us. Okay. I think there's an episode somewhere in there.